Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 3. Interview in Aruis. Rune was uneasy. It could simply be that he was restless, as so often during high sun tide, or that the weather seemed to hint at change for the worse, and his voyage back was a mere day away. Or maybe the well-prepared adversary of the day before had prompted his active mind into awareness of a ruthless and dangerous enemy. He allowed himself to run through the usual list, yet topped by his brother Fengor. After more than 10 cycles, he could remember clearly still the diplomatic necessity that had prevented the king from destroying his own brother, and simultaneously revealing his own shame. Fengor had banished him with a cold fury that he had realized would follow him for the rest of his life. It was a secret fury that had to find its manifestation in plots and intrigue to protect its author. Rune smiled wryly as he contemplated the legal injustice the holder of power allowed for himself. It was strange how one only ever questioned such authority when subject to its cruelty. But he would probably have acted in the same way, he supposed, if he had been the firstborn. Aethera would not have been his brothers. Then there was Perian, Duke of Estium, a proud and ruthless man whose honor had to be maintained at the expense of other men. Was it inevitable that such a man would regard him as an enemy, would set in motion a bitter rivalry in word and petty deed, with the intention of discrediting or destroying its object? Perian would revel in the tidings of his being bested in the arena, especially since that would mean that he no longer drew breath in Myril. So would Gran, Rune's neighbor in the Isles. At least he made no secret of his animosity. It was a simple struggle for resources and the favor of Rasgent, who held sway in Kilvest, the primary settlement in Drax Isles. Gran held the advantage, since he indulged primarily in the highly profitable slave trade, supplying landowners and nobles all around the inland sea. Rune had opted for trade in goods with the barbarian tribes in the south, which, though fraught with danger, brought a steady income. Gran's bitter enmity was rooted in the fact that Rune, as a newcomer, had displaced him so easily as Rasgent's favorite and possible heir, for the Lord of Kilvest was getting on and had no surviving issue. Gran's scheming nature would be the one to hatch some kind of showdown in the arena, not only to rid himself of his rival, but also disgrace his memory. Several lesser nobles and merchants subsequently claimed his attention, but the names at the top of the list remained as the most likely. Of the three, only Gran could have been present the day before, and this fact elevated him to prime suspect. His probing thoughts were interrupted by his arrival at the Hall of Council, a large hexagonal cavern in the western wing of the palace. The 2 westernmost walls had been reduced to columns only, affording an exquisite view of the harbor and the sea beyond. The hall had a business-like air about it, as if the scores of debates and careful considerations it had seen had left behind some traces of the wisdom of the men who had propagated and planned their schemes here. Arranged seats and trestle tables stood about in anticipation of yet another such discussion of recent initiatives. Selected coats of arms on the walls announced the participants. Rune noted each carefully, and the order of arrangement also. It was expedient to keep abreast of the shifting fortunes of the prominent families in Ligerium. King Tregoran dismissed the secretary with whom he was conferring as soon as Rune approached. A tall man, with graying beard and temples, the king had seen a reasonably successful rule of 9 cycles after his father had abdicated in his favor. Ligerian law allowed a rule of no more than 20 cycles, after which a monarch had to appoint a successor, traditionally, but not exclusively, from his own extended family. This state of affairs had its merits, but could generate its own peculiar quandaries. Tregoran was a diplomat at heart, and needed a strong council of nobles to spur him on to any action that would cause more than a mild disturbance in the somewhat troubled waters of Ligurian security. A recent escalation in raids through the Tristwood and Lysan to the south had prompted vigorous calls from Estium and the borderland for decisive action, since the king in neighboring Lysan seemed unable or unwilling to prevent the passing of bands of desert raiders through his territory. Moreover, the Ligurian deputation had met with an unexpectedly hostile reception in Lysan. The thought of an approaching costly war weighed heavily on the king's mind. The sight of Rune deepened the frown creasing his brow, though the task at hand was insignificant compared to the Lysan debacle. Not that it would be any less unpleasant. He detested squabbles involving blood relations, and the quarrel between the Nurian king and his brother had done nothing but reinforce this view. He did not tolerate any such feuds within his own family, but dealt with any disunity or intrigue that would dare to surface in a ruthless and vehement style his general rule lacked. Naturally, this cultivated a certain amount of hypocrisy within the royal family. He did not dislike the Nurian man, despite his arrogance and lack of gentleness. Indeed, the fellow commanded a certain respect, with his physical prowess and the success he had made of the dangerous southern trading enterprise he had launched. Then, of course, he was powerfully connected to Rasgent of Kilvest, whom one ignored at one's peril, aged or no. Rune approached with some trepidation, the beginnings of a frown on his brow to match Tregoran's own. His relations with the Ligurian king had always been cordial and mutually beneficial, yet the mood had somehow changed, and judging by the atmosphere surrounding him, for the worse. When they were alone, Tregoran drew a deep breath and turned to face the Nurian.
"Lord Rune, I appreciate your promptness."
His words were articulated with care, deepening the tension. "My Lord King, I have no reason in the past to disrespect the summons from you." Tregoran forced a slight smile, resembling a grimace.
"All that is about to change."
He turned away to look out over the sea traffic in the port.
"I will come to the point."
He twisted his head round to face Rune, who noticed a slight artificiality in tone that betrayed a speech that had been rehearsed more than once before delivery.
"You appreciate my position, I'm certain, and therefore you are probably aware of my continual resistance to overtures made regarding this matter since your departure from Nuria. There has been considerable diplomatic pressure exercised on me for allowing you trade and safe passage within my realm, pressure that I can no longer ignore. Certain troubles in the south have finally forced a more active alliance between your brother and me. My tolerance will therefore have to be sacrificed for the greater good."
He paused for breath, while studying the impassive face of the Nurian to gauge his reaction. Could he detect a flicker of anger?
"I am forced to do what I do now."
He paused again to emphasize the point.
"You will not trade or travel within the realm of Ligurium and Estium forthwith. This ban will apply to you and your issue for 4 generations. You will not seek to engage in diplomacy or trade with any of its citizens within another realm or employ agents to further your interests here. This ban will be in effect from dawn 5 days hence."
The words, though forceful by nature, were not spoken thus, and rather seemed to carry a tone of resignation to what had merely been postponed before, an inevitability. Rune had felt the cold fury weigh down his limbs at the first suspicion of what was being said. He struggled to keep his face from showing the blind anger he had attempted to master for 10 cycles or more. Although he had anticipated such an eventuality for some time, the shock of it still affected him too strongly for his liking. What matter if a door closed for him here? And yet it mattered, only if it reminded him of the intense hate of his sibling and his own ineptitude. He swallowed hard before replying. "I have indeed marveled at your resilience in this matter. Defying one's most powerful ally for so long may seem folly to some. He extended a hand that was grasped almost too eagerly. For the cycles you have allowed me trade and passage, I owe you a great debt, Trigoran. It may be, on some distant future day, that I can repay you fittingly. The king hesitated a moment when he released the wrist. Was there a veiled threat in these parting words? Was he regarded as a traitor now, a turncoat that would have to be recompensed in like manner? The Nurian sense of honor had always baffled the reasonable men of Ligurium. Surely this man would not bear a grudge for what had been unavoidable. He looked for an instant straight into the feline eyes that had narrowed almost imperceptibly, that had marked the tone of voice, and measured the slight hesitations during the delivery of his carefully chosen words. He discerned the menace this outcast embodied, even to a king such as he. In a way, he was relieved to be rid of him. He could think of a number of his nobles who would rejoice at the news. Yet it grieved him that such a man would be lost to a kingdom that needed strong and ruthless soldiers. Ruin did not allow the silence to fortify any sentiments of ill, but turned quickly on his heel after a nod at Trigoran, and measured his strides out of the hall. Nurians did not bow even to royalty of their own nation, despising the scraping and fawning other kings seemed to demand as their due. The walls of the palace were pressing in on him suddenly, making him eager to break out into Imran's light. He quickened his pace, his mind filled with the blue of a sun-dyed sky and ocean, the freedom of the salty breezes, the swift passage of his ship slipping through unfathomable waters. The entrance hall was populated with an excessive number of columns, obscuring one's view of the gates. They marched in grey stony ranks round a central square containing a sprinkling of greenery and a tiny ornamental fountain. Several birds that presumably nested in some of the alcoves congregated round it in noisy companionship. Rune's keen advance round one of these stone pillars almost carried him headlong into a solitary woman. She uttered a little cry of surprise and took a step backwards in bewilderment. He would have dismissed her as a mere serving girl since she had no retinue, but her dress and manner quickly identified her as a person of quality. As he scrutinized her carefully, he made an attempt to recompose the expression of irritation reserved for unwanted disturbances from servants that had automatically formed on his brow, to a more amiable one. He did not recognize her, yet she seemed familiar to him somehow. Yes, she resembled the queen, a dark-haired beauty of Estium named Riwen, whose marriage with Trigoran had not merely been one of statecraft. This young woman had her same dark hair, but a much softer version of Riwen's striking beauty. Her voice was different too, less practiced and forceful.
Lord Rune, it is most fortunate that I should encounter you here so unexpectedly.
You are acquainted with me, lady?
Yes, that is, no, not directly. I merely know you from what I have heard from others and, the arena.
Rune would have smiled at the suppressed shudder in her voice had he not been loath to pass any more time here, now that his welcome had expired. He raised his brow instead. And do I have the honor of being acquainted with you? She had recovered her composure by now.
Your pardon, Lord. I am Trigoran and Riwen's youngest and least significant daughter, Haldred.
There was a trace of a smile. Of course. May I state that you honor your parents' reputation for comeliness, despite your lack of retinue?
I am not in the habit of dragging a welter of servants and guards with me, as if I had need of status or protection, sir. This is my father's house.
Her tone betrayed a slight irritation, with his hint of disapproval of her conduct. Are you not tied to Julos of Estium? Why neglect to introduce yourself as a wife? She visibly forced herself to remain civil.
I would have arrived at that point if I had not to deal with your critical compliment first.
He continued as if she had not spoken. I cannot say that I blame you. Your husband has done his best to establish himself as a lecherous buffoon. You must be eager to free yourself of his taint. His voice was matter-of-fact. Haldred was shocked. She was aware, of course, of the countless wagging tongues regarding her husband's exploits at court, as well as the stifled laughs and mocking glances of the baser elements in the palace, but she had never had a relative stranger casually blurt out such pointed insults to her face. For a moment or two she was at a loss. The image of the arrogant sword-wielding executioner leaped up in her imagination. The man seemed unperturbed and unaware of her discomfort. His eyes were somewhat cold and neutral, exuding an air of fortified indifference. "May I inquire as to why you would regard it as fortunate to meet me here? Can it be that you are aware of my newly awarded status, or that you have been even before I was?" Haldred detected more than a touch of bitterness. It was puzzling, but she did not have the inclination to pursue it through the haze of her own hurt feelings.
"I know not to what you refer, my lord. I had hoped to acquire from you some information that could be of a sensitive nature."
Had.
"You seemed rather pressed with other concerns."
"I am." Rune realized that she could not be aware of his fresh eviction as yet. It improved his mood slightly. "I am not necessarily disinclined. However, I depart for Cairton tomorrow, and do not know when I will have the pleasure of sojourning in your fair city again. If your business with me is of an urgent nature, I would advise you to proceed with it immediately."
"You are most gracious, my lord."
Her words lacked conviction.
"I do not intend occupying much of your time, but I must insist that we converse in a more appropriate and secluded locale. My husband is not very tolerant regarding the taking of liberties he allows himself."
Rune smiled scornfully, but refrained from commenting. Instead, he offered her an arm and steered her towards one of the many anterooms and salons adjoining the entrance hall. Her arm was rigid and remote, as if contact with his was most unnatural. He almost enjoyed the unease his presence inspired in her, the disquiet nearly all these Ligerians felt when confronted with his ruthless superiority and otherness. In his mind he was starting the process of severing every tie that still connected him to this land, casually flinging away every conversation, every relationship and dalliance, every qualified hope. As with Nuria, bonds of any nature would only fester frustration and bitterness on which a man eventually might choke to death. As those of Nuria, the affairs of these people were no longer any concern of his. Haldred forced her voice to remain as neutral as possible. It would not do to create an impression of an overexcited young girl whose imagination had been running away with her. Although she had not been able to shake the horrible possibilities conjured by Venge's words from her mind, she could not reveal this to the inevitably cynical Nurian. She would have to proceed carefully to gain the information she could.
"I regret the unusual manner of our meeting, my lord, but there are certain questions to which you may aid me in finding answers. Please understand that I am not inquisitive by nature, and would refrain from accosting relative strangers and questioning them as a matter of course, but I have recently heard some disturbing rumors, and would like to confirm some of the suspicions engendered by these. You are Nurian by birth, and therefore may be privy to information that is unknown or relegated to tales in Ligerium. I will be as brief and direct as possible in my questions, and would ask that you would be the same in your responses. If I may proceed?"
"Please." Rune was slightly surprised at this little speech, and had to give her credit for an ability to think beyond the level of the average Ligerian female of class, whose preoccupation with physical enticements had sometimes robbed them of any capacity for thought beyond the adornment and painless piercing of their pampered bodies. At the same time, he was intrigued by what she could possibly want to know. Haldred had had little time to compose the type of questions she would have deemed appropriate, and was apprehensive. She could not risk hesitating, though, and hoped she would not give herself away before she had at least learned what she wanted. Her manner did not betray her state of mind, however.
"How well do you know our southern ally, Malik Yulian?"
"Reasonably well." Rune hesitated for a moment. "He has considerable influence in the city of Munborg, where I do the greater part of my training. He is highly respected there, even feared. I need not mention that that region is rather uncivilized. It takes a considerable man to force respect in such a place. Indeed, without his favor, or at least neutrality, it is impossible to operate any type of endeavor in the area."
"I take it that you have met with him on occasion?"
"Only once have I had the honor, and then only as part of a deputation from Rasgen."
"Was there anything strange about his appearance?"
"Strange? In what way?"
"Out of the ordinary."
"What is the ordinary? Ligerian?"
"Yes. No. Does he appear to be A human?
I would think so. Why would he not be?
How old is he?
That is not a simple question when I consider it, though one would expect it to be. Why does it matter to you?
How old?
He smiled. Is this an interrogation?
Have you no idea?
I have an idea, but I could not say for certain. I'm Nurian, and that would suggest that my history stretches back no more than 600 cycles, as you should be aware. In Nuria, the prehistory of the Viron is not regarded as significant. We were reborn after the summoning. Referring to the time preceding that event is somehow uncouth. Moreover, whole libraries were destroyed during the cleansing to eradicate the last records of our earlier, darker past. History taught to children in Nuria would not precede the summoning by more than a few cycles.
A pity, though I find it hard to believe that you would not be curious about the past.
Of course, but learning is mostly controlled by the priesthood, whose primary members frown on those asking about the dark past that should be shunned at all costs.
And there are no other means of obtaining information about the events preceding the summoning? You are aware, of course, that there were not enough books or records left in the whole of Ligerium after the War of Annihilation, to compose more than a single library. Our own history stretches back about as far as that of Nuria.
Rune regarded her with increasing puzzlement. Are you a scholar, then? And your interest is merely academic? It would suit you better to contact a learned counterpart in Nuria.
You just mentioned that the study of prehistory is not encouraged in Nuria.
Haldred sighed impatiently.
Besides, I do not have the means to travel there now that I belong to Julos of Estium. I am honest with you, Lord Rune, and certainly not academically inclined.
You seem to think and say more than most Ligerian females. Once more Haldred was struck by his stark disregard for courtesy. She tried not to show her displeasure.
All I require from you is information. Please do not question my motives.
He nodded without speaking, but kept his probing eyes locked on hers. She gathered her thoughts with an effort.
You have no idea how old he may be.
He is certainly older than the current records of Nuria, for his origin is not mentioned anywhere in the histories we are taught. Unless, of course, it has been purposely omitted. I have my doubts, though. His brow creased for a moment. He did play an important role during the cleansing. That much is known. He was on the Council of Reconstruction. He pressed most strongly for the banning of the Initiate's course and the formation of the priesthood.
Initiate's course?
Yes, an ancient rite for young Viron boys. It involved making their way up to the towers and somewhere within its caverns, supposedly discovering the secret of their identity or purpose. But it is all speculation now. It was replaced by a rather formal and meaningless affair presided over by the High Quester and performed at regular intervals every cycle, mainly for incorporating apprentices into the warrior guilds. There is still some mystic ritual. Am I boring you? Haldred had looked away towards the tapestry behind him.
No, I was merely reflecting.
She fixed her eyes on the Nurian again.
To what race does he belong, then? His extraordinary age would exclude him from any race with which I am familiar.
He is probably one of the Tour. He has championed their cause for cycles without count, and kept their marshlands safe from invasion, even while the northern lands were ravished. Their secret of nature makes it difficult to ascertain whether there could be men among them who have lived beyond 600 cycles. Indeed, it is difficult to ascertain anything definite about them.
Granted. But what would you say if you learned that he had more than 3,000 cycles?
Rune looked at her quizzically. It was clear that he was not prepared to believe such a claim out of hand. She continued hurriedly.
I have it from a very reliable source.
He shrugged. If he has that many in truth, then you are correct. He belongs to no race that I'm aware of. Then he is one of the ancients, like Kale.
And perhaps as unpredictable as he?
What are you implying? She turned away from him and started pacing the floor.
What possible reason could someone like Malik Yulian have for desiring the downfall and destruction of Nuria?
She could feel the astonishment her question had engendered, and purposely did not look at the man. Rune paused to collect his thoughts. His first reaction was to regard her question as preposterous. He was on the verge of telling her so, when a nagging doubt lodged itself in his mind. What did he know about the strange ruler of Terrallen? Why indeed would he defend the motives of a man that he had admitted could be of similar origins as the hated Kale the Summoner? He measured his reply carefully. "I am not aware of any reason you would have for wishing such. I assume you also have this confidence from your reliable source?" Haldred continued.
And would I be correct to assume that Nuria itself holds very much the same opinion as yours?
"I cannot speak for every Nurian, of course, but yes, the ones I know would not consider such a possibility."
And neither would you consider the possibility of his control over the ravishing swarm?
Now Rune was truly taken aback. Malik Yulian was a well-known and respected ally, even if the man himself was somewhat of an enigma. What this woman was suggesting was absurd. His reply carried a trace of mockery. "No, I would not."
Even when his own lands are kept safe, and Ligerium and Nuria always bear the brunt?
"Why would this concern you? The swarm itself is almost a thing of legend." She stopped her pacing and whirled to face him.
It will never be a thing of legend in Ligerium. You Nurians have perpetually reaped the honor of ultimately defeating the pillaging hordes. But Ligerians found no glory in trying to locate dismembered bodies of loved ones, rebuilding shattered cities and towns, or facing starvation and poverty in the wake of this terror. Always we have been your buffer, absorbing the spearhead of this madman's hate that was perpetually directed at you.
She felt her hand shaking slightly and forced them to her sides. At once this Nurian in front of her became an object of abhorrence, the face in a faceless picture of snug Nurian lords dividing the spoils and recounting the glories after the defeat of yet another swarm, while her own countrymen would squabble for the scraps and crawl back to their devastated homeland. There they would face bitter toil to rebuild and restore. Rune had formed quite a different picture in his mind. "You are the victim of some political maverick, trying to sow discord between your precious Ligerium and Nuria. I would advise you not to meddle in affairs that concern you not." She was angry now, but still struggled to control herself.
Concern me not. I am not a ruler or potentate, but it concerns me when helpless children wander the forests without parents or shelter, to succumb to starvation or disease, when women have to creep out at night to glean stubble from the burnt fields, their bodies broken and ravished, their husbands slaughtered like animals. It concerns me when for cycles after murderous bands roam the countryside, and we have to maim and kill our own to restore some semblance of order.
"You make out as if Nuria never suffered. We had our losses, and if you were always caught between, we never abandoned you to be annihilated. Besides, your vehement argument involves historical occurrences that matter little now."
What would you say if you knew we were on the verge of another such occurrence, one that would dwarf the others?
She was glaring at him wide-eyed, putting forward a challenge to refute her statement. At the same time, she was a little mystified by the intensity of her anger. Was it merely that he did not believe her, or was it his callous arrogance? "Where did you learn this?" The strange eyes were probing, compelling. Haldred was filled with an intense dislike for this man. She regretted her decision to request an interview. She forced herself to calm down and looked away from him again.
Please, if you are not willing to answer my questions, I have no intention of insisting.
"I am more than willing. However, you must understand that the questions are somewhat extraordinary. Once again, you are probably citing your secret source. You have no reason to doubt this intelligence." Haldred was suddenly tired of the somewhat fruitless conversation. It had been a mistake. It was time to end it.
Perhaps yes, but then I have heard nothing as yet to rule out the threat either.
He snorted disdainfully. "Come now, that is a childish argument. In the absence of strong evidence, such rumors may simply be classed as old wives' tales."
I expected such a response from the likes of you, Lord Rune. But nevertheless, I thank you for your time. It was most kind of you.
"The likes of me?" He smiled at her, but he was suddenly and inexplicably offended. So this second-rate princess had him neatly weighed and measured. They all seemed to have his measure, his brother, the questors of his boyhood, the impotent Ligerian king. He did not attempt to keep the malicious insinuation out of his response. You know much about men, then? The kind of things a person learns by looking at a man in the arena, I suppose. One would be tempted to assume that the whole conversation we have had was merely a pretense to alleviate the loneliness of a neglected and discarded wife, perchance. Haldred realized that the intention of these words was to belittle and ridicule her, and yet she could not prevent herself from feeling exactly those emotions she believed she had mastered. She kept her composure with an extreme effort. Her reply was cold and neutral.
All the more reason to convey my sincere gratitude to you, then, Lord Rune. A safe journey to you.
Rune thought of several more insulting retorts before he discarded them all and merely said, I no longer have the luxury of concerning myself with the affairs of Nuria or Ligurium. I have no compassion for its people, or interest in its welfare. If there is indeed a cataclysmic threat to the safety of my former home, I cannot see myself rallying to the defense of a land I have no part in. I have not travelled the realm of Maligulian, but if he has the power to destroy these kingdoms, it may be that he has reason to. I doubt, though, that such a threat exists. More's the pity. He looked at her as at a silly young child. Good day to you, princess. He nodded and strode out into the colonnade. She remained motionless in response to his brief nod, and only seated herself when she could no longer hear the angry footsteps receding between the columns. She told herself that what had been spoken by this hateful man was without value and to be discarded without delay, and yet she was a little pleased that he had addressed her as the daughter of a king in parting, and not the wife to the lowly and faithless younger brother of a duke. Rune kept up a steady pace till he was well out of the palatial grounds. He headed for the docks and his ship, where he would spend this last evening in Aruis, for all he knew, the last ever in Ligurium. At least he would be with men who were loyal to him, and had seen what he was capable of, not what he appeared to be or what they wanted him to be. These men were of mixed races and uncertain origins, who had found a home and refuge in Caerton in the Isles. They were fiercely faithful to him, for he was a man of strength, and their means of gaining a measure of wealth and security amidst the cutthroat competition of the Track Islanders. And he felt a liking for them that he had not experienced among any other group. With them, one was what one did. There was no blind group loyalty or misplaced weakening affection. Any relationship was merely for mutual benefit, and when it no longer suited, it could be terminated at a wink. This simple rule he had embraced eagerly as the guiding principle. What then if Ligurium no longer saw him as a benefit? What then if he had to suffer some lowly merchant to grow fat on reselling his goods to the Ligurians? Had he not done the same for cycles with Nuria? The Nurians would curse his memory and eat the exotic fruits his ships had carried from the south. What a despicable lot they were, and now the Ligurians would do the same, weaklings. The crew had all but completed the restocking of the vessel when he arrived. The last of the fresh produce would be loaded by eventide. The cargo for trade in the Isles had been loaded days before. It was only his insatiable desire for the arena that had kept them here this long. They would all sleep on board this night, as was the tradition. He would not allow a delay in their departure at first light on the morrow. There would be ale and companionship enough tonight, though the journey back home should not take more than 3 days. Yes, he would drink with them tonight, to the memories they had shared and the uncertain future of the ocean wanderer.